the challenge for any currency is that it has to be of pretty stable value.
Right.
Okay. It can't go up 50%, down 50% in short periods of time, because if you're a business, okay, and certainly households, but if you're a business,
right,
you don't want to be selling something, like a car, and then next month, whatever that was is now worth 50% less.
right.
Because you can't manage your business well that way.
100%. Yeah, I mean, especially if you're, selling something, and even like back in the early days of currency, you sell something for 100 Bitcoin, that's now worth $60,000, $1,000. You know what I mean? And imagine you sold it something of that value. It's like you lost that value,
That's right.
in terms of the growth of it. But that definitely presents a very hard challenge, I think, for, cryptocurrencies that are trying to come about now, because they're going to be volatile naturally by, the nature of what they are. They're going, because they have to establish a value. And while people buy into it, because I guess, they say a currency only has as much value as how many people are using. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of The Conscious Endeavor. We're here talking about the self, reality, consciousness, society, all the good stuff. I'm joined with Mr. David Axelrod here. Should I say doctor?
Technically, but
Right, cool. So professor of economics, been teaching for quite some time now, right?
Yep.
Why don't we just discuss, maybe start by talking about what classes you teach, what do you work with, and maybe even how you got into economics, for example.
Sure. As far as how did I get into economics, I actually studied math and statistics as an undergraduate and minored in economics. And then I was interested in a graduate program, and I figured it was going to be between math, stat, and economics, whichever one was going to offer me
right.
some kind of money to
go. A very mathematical economic decision.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And so it ended up with economics. And I've always kind of looked at economics not so much as about, obviously it is about money and material things, but I always kind of understood it as a quantitative philosophy.
Interesting.
Because if you read the theory, if you read it's very, very deep.
Yeah.
And it's one of the distinctions between, let's say, studying finance and economics.
Right.
If all you're concerned about is money, you go into finance.
Mm-hmm.
If you kind of want the bigger picture, especially if you're interested in, socioeconomics,
right,
well-being, then you go more towards economics.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because all of this stuff is inherently, in terms of economic systems, they're all inherently related to human behavior, to society.
Yep.
And you have things like, services. General services are things that people need, right? So when you're creating a business, a lot of times you need that framing of like, what do people want, right? Where are demands sitting and things like that.
Yep.
And it becomes a much more larger picture of the evaluation, not only of the monetary value, but of like, where are the systems moving towards, right? Like,
yep. Bringing up the notion of monetary value. So one of the early distinctions, if you get into economics deeply enough, is looking at the history of economic thought. You go back a few hundred years, time of Adam Smith and what we might call the more early,
the founding of capitalism,
at least in the West.
Right.
There's a whole a whole kind of economics that was kind of coming out of Islam.
Right, like the merchants
earlier on, and
like that.
And also their own understanding. And they had their own scholars that were making progress in understanding economic systems. But in terms of the West, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and then eventually get to like Karl Marx, and then you get into the 20th century thinkers like Friedman and Samuelson, and then the end of the 20th century, you get into behavioral economics, which really takes economics in a different direction. And in terms of value, as you were pointing out, early economists weren't necessarily focused completely on financial value. All right, they were thinking in terms of like the surplus value from producing things that people want, and use. And over time, economists tended to start equating the two, because the fundamental principle is someone's not going to buy something unless it's valuable enough to them.
Right.
Okay. And that drove a lot of thinking in the late 19th century, 20th century, and even till today. And some of that is on the mark, right? You know, if you're rational and, you know, if you've got enough resources and all the other types of things, yeah, you'll probably won't buy something unless it's at least worth that much to you.
Right.
On the other hand, there are plenty of situations where it's not that simple.
Yeah, I mean, value in general too, it stands for something, and you know, money in general being a kind of I guess the stand-in of value, represents value, but it has to come from, you know, particular resources. I mean, going back even, as you said, you know, ancient Arabic Islamic systems, you know, our number system is Arabic, no? Isn't that, it comes from those things?
Yep. If you go further back, the concept of zero, that goes back to, India. And
Really?
Hindu. And yeah, so the West has been very good at adapting, you know, what was, you know, learned previously. You know, there's a whole other layer of conversation that we had about, you know, whether it's to what extent it's appropriation, creation.
Right.
But a lot of cultures build on previous cultures.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. What works proliferates, right?
That's
becomes
right.
a part of the system.
That's right.
But yeah, even to touch on, I mean, you mentioned things like Karl Marx and other thinkers. I mean, those are really like societal movements. I mean, he was the Communist Manifesto, correct?
Correct. Communist Manifesto in the 1840s. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's really just talking about different systems of how people operate and, you know, I guess share value or create value or things like that.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about Karl Marx is he is, while he, in one sense, he is an economist. He is more, I think, of a historian, sociologist, and unfortunately, a failed revolutionary. He did, out of the Communist Manifesto, lead, basically union work. Well, I'd say it was workers revolts in the 1840s and 1850s.
Okay. Yeah, and was he American? I don't know.
No.
He's Russian.
Karl Marx, I believe, German.
German, okay.
Central American.
Right.
I mean, he spent a lot of his life in England.
Okay.
But his main concern was the plight of the worker in capitalism at that time. And workers did not have a very good deal at the time. They were just a little bit better off than slaves.
Right. I mean, this is also prior to all the kind of regulating bodies that worker safety, workers' comp.
Right. Exactly.
All those things.
Exactly.
Yeah. They get exploited by owners, by things like that. And I mean, coming from, I guess, also like feudalism, right? You're given a plot of land, you develop that plot of land, everything you make is a product of the kingdom, you know, those sorts of things.
It goes to the Lord and the Lord sends it to the king.
Right.
Yeah. So I think part of the challenge of having capitalism in the free market embraced more widely really required a greater percentage of the population actually benefiting from it in a substantial way.
Right. To get people to be behind it.
To get people, yeah, exactly.
Right.
So Karl Marx goes off in a different direction. And he sees the fundamental problem being ownership and basically the concentration of wealth, which is perpetually an issue. Okay.
Right.
With
even today.
Yes, exactly. And so he brings up some very valid points, but he also misses some critical things. Okay. So in terms of sharing society, the ideal in communism is that all of the resources are communally managed and owned and shared, which is a fine vision. Okay. except that you're still going to have the political.
Right.
Who is the one that's going to make the decision?
Right. You need a lot of regulation on top of that.
You need a lot of regulation on top of that.
Who's going to house whatever the resource is? How does it get distributed? How does it go from point A to point B? I mean, what amount of time do you have with it? You know?
Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. And one of the reasons why the free market, or at least the marketplace in capitalism, has succeeded is that instead of trying to have all those decisions made by a small group of very high-level political people, there's a recognition that, as many things in life, you're better off if you let the person who's closest to the problem handle it.
Right.
And essentially, distribute that decision making, so that instead of only, like I said, only having a handful of people, now you've got millions of people helping you to make decisions. They're smaller decisions, okay? But that's the difference between, let's say, long-term planning, okay, and having to do the improv that's most of life.
Right.
Right.
Especially in a small business, like
especially in a small business
is at your disposal, and you're solving problems locally as they arise, kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Even to touch on too, I mean, mentioning these kind of like these social systems, capitalism being, again, locally solving issues, by the individual, by the proprietor or whoever's doing that. To kind of jump around here, with the World Economic Forum recently, when, in their words, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, right? You've seen this whole thing. And now, does that not border on this idea of, communist kind of thinking? Or, because, I mean, they're allegedly, based of a group of capitalists coming together, trying to solve issues, but, they're getting into the share economy. I mean, we've seen the rise of things like Uber, like ride sharing and things like this. They're seeing that is the system that proliferates a lot of times, but I don't know. Yeah,
the insights there, because those simple aphorisms can very easily be misunderstood, misinterpreted.
Right.
But the element of truth there is that if you're going to own things and be serious in the management of it, the maintenance of it, acquiring and distributing the resources necessary, like say for like a major business, right? That's very time consuming. Okay. And you need either a tremendous amount of experience already doing the work, or a lot of education, or preferably both.
Right.
And so one way of understanding that idea of you're going to own nothing is that, and be happy with it, is that you'll still be renting things. You'll still be buying. It's not like it'll be out of nowhere.
Right.
You'll still have to earn a living. Okay. But instead of owning a home and a car and, having to be on top of that all the time, someone else is going to deal with all those issues.
Right.
Okay. And to the extent that society is going to, the term I like to use is there'll be a specialization of consciousness. Okay. So you've heard of specialization of labor.
Right. Yeah. Division of labor.
Division of labor. Right.
Right.
So if you have a division of labor, if you have a specialization of labor, you're going to adapt your mind and the way you understand the world and how you focus the world to that work.
Right.
Well, that's a specialization of consciousness.
Right. If you're a farmer, if you're a mechanic, if you're, a tailor or whatever.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. So one way to understand it is in terms of time frame, and in economics, we talk about time preference. So right now, okay, and for everyone who's watching, there's all this stuff that's going on in the world, okay? Tremendous amount of stuff. But in this moment right now, we're in this room, we're talking with each other. We have a wonderful engineer on the other side. And we're focused on what's happening right here, right now. Because it's going to take all that mind energy that we have to be coherent, okay? to be doing what we're doing to come out with this podcast. So for at least this little moment here, we're kind of ignoring everything else that's going around outside.
Right.
You know, we're inside four walls. That makes it a lot easier to ignore everything else that's going on. That is part of the challenge of what it means to be rational and to be in control of your own life, to be autonomous.
Mm-hmm.
We're never perfectly autonomous.
Right.
We're only autonomous within the particular scope that we're focusing on.
Yeah, and this is kind of like in the sense of like our thinking can be linear. We can go from point A to point B, but by doing so, we have to kind of block out the other issues in order to solve the singular.
Yes,
issue,
absolutely.
Is what you're saying.
As a matter of fact, another way to understand that is many of the advances in mathematics, like calculus, for huge advance,
Mm-hmm.
okay, not only for math, but also for science and physics and such,
Right.
is built on assuming that for a very, very small change in time or change in distance, it's approximately a linear change,
Mm-hmm.
okay? Now, it's not perfectly true, but it happens to be a close enough approximation that it allows us to understand what's going on in the world
Mm-hmm.
more effectively and of greater priority, being able to predict
Right.
and to be able to choose what's going on.
Right. So, and in terms of these like kind of systems of, I guess, management, and again, like echoing this World Economic Forum idea, you're saying that other people will kind of have to step in to make the decisions in terms of resource exchange, resource flow, right? So with the example you used was like a house, for example. And I know you're saying like if people own a house, or because one of the problems even in America is like, you know, there's more vacant homes than there are homeless people, you know? So technically, if we're able to redistribute that, is that kind of along that line of thinking, like solving societal problems by kind of like top-down execution? Is that
That would be part of it.
Right.
I think another way to understand it is, let's say you are a homeowner.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you own your one home. Okay. Now, there are all sorts of things you need to do to keep up the maintenance of your home.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Plumbing, carpentry,
molding, roofing,
preventing mold,
cutting
your grass.
You know, you're going to want to have insurance.
Right.
Okay. You need to pay taxes.
Which flood insurance is different from like regular insurance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's interesting. That division kind of makes it difficult to keep up with in that sense.
That's correct.
Right.
And one way to understand it is, if you're making decisions and you're doing it for 1,000 houses, you get to use certain techniques out of economics and finance that if you're just a single person, it's just too much effort.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're just dealing with one house. But if you're dealing with 1,000 homes, okay, now these, what we would call fixed costs of operation, get spread out, okay?
Right.
And now that average cost can be lowered.
Right.
And that's sort of the principle behind here. It's,
okay.
Yes, you may not own much, but you'll be able to, you know, borrow or rent it only when you need it.
Right.
Okay. Which means that overall it may cost you less.
Right.
Okay.
And the operation would be handled in terms of maintenance, things like that, kind of out of sight, out of mind. I mean, if you have specialized, we already have the division of labor.
That's right.
People who are, you know, sufficiently proficient at, let's say, plumbing would go to the house that needed it. It would be managed at a higher
That's
level.
right.
I mean, it's interesting too, because I mean, if you look at, and this is just an analogy, but if you look at biology, for example, like your liver is not concerned about the oxygen ratio in your blood, right? It's doing a very specific job. It stays focused on what it needs to do, you know, and your kidneys are not worried about pumping your blood like your heart is, right? So kind of localizing certain tasks makes the whole system more efficient.
That's the idea.
Yeah,
that's the idea.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So also just to echo too, you have your book, Economics of Time and Mind.
Well,
right?
it'll be out soon, but
Okay.
I had developed the course Economics of Time in Mind.
Yeah. And you talk a lot in that about like long-term rationality in terms of
Yes.
how do we
Yeah.
get, and that's kind of echo like this idea. I mean, especially when we talk about things like sustainability, climate change, aspects like that, it becomes a lot of times, especially if we look at like the common literature or just the way that we speak about it amongst ourselves, it's like, well, how do we as individuals change to be more sustainable? So it's like, oh, I should commute less. I should, use public transportation. I should turn the water off when I brush my teeth, conserve water, do all these sorts of things. And a lot of times the thinking is that the individual holds the burden of trying to change their lifestyle in order to make these macroscopic changes in the way that we sustainably, run our society. But that doesn't seem to be very fruitful. And also it kind of impinges on the individual. Like, do we impose water limits or do we impose these sorts of things? And that ends up getting into pretty muddy water, right? So in terms of like long-term rationality, you're thinking like, how do we change this system of society to become more sustainable? How do we get people to kind of push in that direction without infringing on, I guess, individual liberties and things like that? Yeah.
You're bringing up a very, very critical point here. And it's one of the things that has sort of been a criticism of Western culture,
right?
Is the depending on who you're asking, obviously, but in terms of long-term issues around sustainability, individual freedom in the sense of the individual gets to choose all the time,
right,
what they're doing,
and even to know what the best thing to do is.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. One of the reasons why Western economics rose the way it has in the last couple of hundred years is, one, it's been pretty successful at generating the material needs that keep society going. So that's the first requirement of any socioeconomic system.
Right. Production.
Production to keep it going. The other is the appeal to personal freedom. You get to choose. People don't tell you what to do. You get to choose. And one of the early economists, when that was brought up, said, for most people, their choice will be the choice of how to die. Will they starve? Will they freeze?
Wow.
Okay. And this is, I think, one of the challenges that we have is that we have been so successful. Our standard of living is so high on average,
right,
that we don't fully appreciate how much had to be built and how much of the system had to already be in place for things to be so simple now. Like just to be able to, go down to the store and get, bottle of milk, bottle of water.
Buy a carrot,
Buy a carrot. There's so much that had to occur for it to be there. And those that are working at the very highest levels, recognize, how do we keep these systems going? So, for example, just to have the equipment to produce cars, produce laptops, furniture, mass production of food.
I mean, wood, right? Specific metals for electronics a lot of the time, like, for example, they talk about, electric cars being part of a solution for sustainability. But at the end of the day, those things, they have to mine lithium, which they are currently mining in South America a lot, digging up entire ecosystems, entire forests, and just digging into the ground deep, trying to do that. And then those systems just create batteries, which then when those die in 10, 15 years are highly, dangerous to the environment. How do you dispose of those? And, even where electric cars get their energy from, you plug them into the grid. And if the grid is not clean, where does that energy come from? So it becomes like a huge, push and pull.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And that's just the raw materials. Okay.
Right.
The other thing is you actually have to have the manufacturing plants
To put it all together. Right.
And those manufacturing plants, it's like a lot of things in the world. It's not like you build it and then it's just there forever, right? That's why we have the notions of depreciation of capital, right? You buy some capital equipment, but as you use it, it wears down, its capacities decrease, and then you either put resources into maintaining it, replacing it, or eventually you just lose that manufacturing capacity altogether. So even if you had all the wood and lithium and all that, if you don't have the manufacturing capacity, you're still not going to make a lot.
Right.
So all of this is very important because there's constantly this tension between if you're an employee, and feeling like, well, I'm helping to produce something that sells for $10,000 and I only see, maybe $500 in wages from that. And that feeling of like, well, what a ripoff. The reality is, and this is a big thing now, is that we're much more reliant on technology and equipment that has to be paid for, that has to be maintained. And when you include all of that, and as well, for example, marketing, because, just because you produce it doesn't mean someone's going to buy it unless they're aware of it, or if you can convince them that it's worthwhile. And so we're seeing more and more of revenues and resources go to research and development, manufacturing plant, maintenance. And it's one of the reasons why we see this movement away from a lot of things done by humans to more and more by robots, AI, and such, because it's more efficient.
Right.
Okay, at least in the near term.
Right. It makes it easier for production. Also, I guess just understanding at what rate certain things decline, certain industries, how often do you, like at what rate should you manufacture so that you don't manufacture too much, right? You sell just the right, getting in that Goldilocks zone, I guess.
Yep.
Right. Of not producing enough, and then the industry doesn't have what it needs, but then you produce, right? So trying to get in that space, you do need kind of a quantitative analysis, which
that's why we're always talking about optimization.
Right.
Because it's not about producing the most you possibly can. It's about producing the amount that is, going to meet the needs of consumers and other businesses, and not so much that now you're wasting your natural resources because you've produced something that no one's going to use.
Yeah, and speaking on efficiency a little bit here. So now, we've had systems of fiat currency and things like that. Now there's a lot of talk about the central bank currencies, right? These central bank digital currencies. Yeah. What's your opinion with that? Do you think that would be something that would work, or that people would go for, or?
Well, if the central banks want to move towards digital currency, either for efficiency purposes or potential control and management.
Right.
Okay. They'll do that, and we will adapt.
Right.
Okay. However, the whole digital currency thing, what's interesting is that, the early, cryptocurrencies kind of sold themselves as you're going to move away from control from the government, right? And having these other alternatives. The challenge for any currency is that it has to be of pretty stable value.
Right.
Okay. It can't go up 50%, down 50% in short periods of time, because if you're a business, okay, and certainly households, but if you're a business,
right,
you don't want to be selling something, like a car, and then next month, whatever that was is now worth 50% less.
Right.
Because you can't manage your business well that way.
100%. Yeah. I mean, especially if you're, selling something, and even like back in the early days of currency, you sell something for 100 Bitcoin, that's now worth $60,000. You know what I mean? And imagine you sold it something of that value. It's like you lost that value,
That's right.
in terms of the growth of it. But that definitely presents a very hard challenge, I think, for, cryptocurrencies that are trying to come about now, because they're going to be volatile naturally by, the nature of what they are. They're going, because they have to establish a value. And while people buy into it, because I guess, they say a currency only has as much value as how many people are using it, or, using it to exchange. The more that it gets exchanged, its value, supposedly increases. So it's going to have volatility. And it's like, we kind of have to get over that hump. I guess initially, we had early adopters of cryptocurrency and things like that. But yeah, it's definitely going to be a hard process, I would think, getting over the hump of like, how do we get it to level out? As people are buying into it. And again, if it's managed by all computers, who's in charge of that? Who maintains that kind of stability that's necessary for it to actually be utilized?
Yeah, you're bringing up some significant issues here. First of all, cryptocurrency is expensive to maintain.
Right.
It's a major energy sink.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen various estimates, but something on the order of, maybe $100, $200, worth of energy per transaction.
Right. So now, if I'm buying something that's $2, it's electricity wise, computing power wise,
is way more than that.
Right.
So clearly that kind of use of digital currency
not viable yet.
Not viable. Right. Not viable. The people and entities that can use it are the ones that have very large transactions. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you're doing $50 million transactions, you don't think twice if it's going to cost you $500.
Yeah.
So that's where the market is.
Right. It's a lot of investment people who are getting into those things.
Well, not just investment. Think about how cryptocurrency was, who were the early adopters? Right. It was the black market.
Right. And people who didn't want to avoid taxes.
They want to avoid taxes. Right. They kind of want to keep things hidden away.
Right.
All of that. So for them, those extra costs, that's just the cost of doing business. And I'm more than happy. No problem. Okay.
Right.
But not at the individual level. The concern that I have, and I think, some other people in finance and economics, is that one of the ways you can reduce the cost is to go into different approaches. There's like proof of ownership, proof of stake,
right.
all of those kind of things. And what you could imagine is that in order to reduce the cost of transaction, you go into algorithms and processes that are in fact less dependable. Okay. They might be more vulnerable to some kind of a hack. Right. They're more vulnerable to, let's say electric grid going down, something like that. And now what you'll have is, for those people who can afford to have the surety of this transaction is going to be, 100% accurate and properly followed, versus those who can't afford that. And maybe it's like, 5% of the time, your money's just going to disappear.
Yeah. Yeah. Dangerous especially for an established economy, for people to adopt it. You want that kind of thing. But for the most part too, cryptocurrencies, a lot of times too, why they took off, like, let alone the idea that it would get us away from central bank manipulations and things like that, was essentially they are less susceptible to inflation, I believe. Because what I heard with Bitcoin is that it had a limited cap on how many could be made. And because of that, it wouldn't inflate, as far as my understanding is.
Okay. So the facts that you're bringing up those are the facts.
Right.
Whether or not it gets impacted by inflation, here's the deal. Yes, it has the advantage of only a finite number of Bitcoins will be made. Mm-hmm. Okay. However, that does not assure that there won't be other digital currencies created.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And if your digital currency is going to be valuable, it's because it can exchange,
Right.
not just for goods and services, but for other currencies.
Right.
So even if, a particular digital currency has a maximum number of coins or units that's going to be mined, there is no, at this point, any cap on how many different currencies there will be.
Right. Yeah, I mean, theoretically, I guess any nation, state, any group of people could at any point create their own currency and start utilizing it and implementing it.
Sure. I mean, think about the European Union, right?
Mm-hmm.
So go back 50 years, every country had its own currency, right? They got to the point where it's like, okay, you know what? There's an inefficiency there. If we had a common currency, which is now the euro, you don't have to go through all that financial exchange. Right. You're not wasting resources, okay, on just handling the finances. That means there's more resources to produce. You can produce at a lower cost, and you can market it to where it's most valuable, okay? And they've had quite a bit of success with that. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of going in the opposite direction.
Right.
If the reason why you want to have this currency is to have, freedom, to not be under the control of a higher governing agency, well, you're not going to stop at only one currency. It's like you could see, imagine the United States. If we started going in the other direction, which is the states start becoming their own countries, well, they'll want to have their own currencies.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, in that, so really the burden for cryptocurrencies in this sense is that there is their universality, whether or not they're going to be used unanimously among all people, because the less people that use it, the less the value would
That's
be.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Essentially.
It's very similar to, social media. The more people use it, right, the greater demand for it, because, it's one thing if you've got one friend on some small, little thing. It's another if you can actually communicate to 10,000 people.
Right. Buying into that system and utilizing that system.
Yeah.
So in this case, but they still are somewhat inflation proof, or, I mean,
I'd be very careful.
Yeah.
With using that phrase.
Right.
It is true that as long as a particular digital currency has no more than a certain amount, that may limit the loss of its buying power. Okay, so that's sort of the opposite side of inflation, right? Is how much can you actually buy with your money?
Right.
But if people can't make their lives work because there's not enough of that currency, they'll go to other currencies.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you're an early adopter, what you're kind of hoping for is that the demand will keep going up and up and up, so that the value of something like Bitcoin keeps going up. But see, that's not using it as money. That is using it as an investment tool.
Right.
Okay.
Right, which is really what people are using it for now. They say, buy a bunch of Bitcoin because the value is going to go up, and then you sell out of it, and it really just becomes like a stock.
That's right.
For the most part, and it's everyone who I know is really involved in it isn't getting Bitcoin so that they can go buy stuff at the grocery store. They're buying it because they think it's going to increase in value, and then what are they going to do? Increase in value relative to the US dollar. So, you buy in with $1,000, you pop out with $5.
Right.
You know what I mean? You're doing this kind of thing. So at the end of the day, I mean, you're using it as a commodity, kind of, if I'm using that term properly.
Kind of sort of like a digital commodity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And ultimately, what are you saying? Well, it's valuable because the dollar is valuable. I want more dollars. Right. So it's just reinforcing the strength of the dollar.
Yeah.
There's always going to be a challenge with how we're going to handle money in a market system. And it's important to recognize that money ultimately is a metaphor for value. And, with that in mind, you can, talk about the rise of the bourgeois culture and all of that. But even in, animal studies, if you introduce something that plays the role of money, they get it very quickly.
Right.
Right. They understand, oh, okay,
I need this in order to operate with whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to have money, then the question is, how do we have financial systems that aren't so volatile?
Right.
Right. I mean, like, what happened in 2008, for example. You don't want to have a financial system that is so overly leveraged, that is so tricky in its design that, it can collapse. That's not helpful.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting with how ridiculously interconnected, just the monetary system is in general, with the fact that, something like 2008, like where car dealers or car manufacturers were going out of business, and how those guys, affect other different systems and in terms of just raw resource control and raw resource flow, it's all ridiculously, interconnected. And I think that's
absolutely
wild. But
and it really brings up a fundamental issue about human consciousness, okay, in all of this, which is how much of the world around us can we actually be aware, conscious of, right? And part of the reasons why we develop our social systems, our economic systems, our legal systems and such like that, is we have a need to be able to trust that the world around us is predictable, right? Going back to what we were talking about earlier.
Right.
And so to even have the experience, I'm not going to say illusion, but I'm going to say experience, the experience of making your own decisions, okay? The experience of making your life better, or, helping other people make their life better. We have to be able to, as individuals, be able to ignore an awful lot to focus on some small thing. And again, something like the financial system, if you're someone who's worked in a hedge fund, or you got that's what you're focusing on. But that also means you're ignoring other things. Okay. And, one example is believing that what you're doing in finance is actually helping society as a whole.
Right.
And there's some reasons to believe that. There are. But that's not always the case. Right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times too, we have like redundant systems, if we're just buying and selling stock, like in people, with hedge funds, it's kind of like they're buying into this and selling out of that. And again, maximizing their own profits, but are they, providing, I guess, value to human life, or any added value? I mean, they're lining their pocket, but are you providing a system that helps people is kind of...
Well, one way to understand how they are providing value, okay, is that in the process of all that, the price of stock and commodity, comes to be determined, and it's constantly being redetermined, right? So it's not like you figured it once and that's the way it's going to be forever, because society's changing, right? Resource availability is changing. So we'd expect prices to change. And if you're talking about stock, you're talking about the value of, businesses. And that is a statement of which businesses are producing things that are valuable.
Right. And they buy into it. They get
and you
value
buy into it,
that.
you can invest in it,
Right.
things like that. So it's not unreasonable to look at what's being done as part of the system that helps to determine um, something like, what are the equilibrium prices that represent something like marginal benefit or marginal cost, okay, to consumers, producers, government. There is that element there. The challenge is that sometimes we talk ourselves into believing that, okay, well, so we're doing this important, valuable thing for society, so it's not immoral or anything like that. And then we go out and we do things which are illegal, okay, or are dangerous because we've kind of, comforted ourselves, well, someone's going to do it. If that makes sense.
Someone's going to do...
Whatever I'm thinking of doing, someone else is going to do it.
Right.
So if it's not me, it'll be someone else. So it's going to happen to society no matter what. So it's going to happen to society no matter what. Why should I, limit myself?
Now, this is maybe in sense, like, let's say if we don't develop arms, another country will, kind of type.
That's one approach. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Not approach, one consideration. Right. So it could be arms. It could be, production of oil. Okay. Generation, production that, have pollution or CO2. Because it's the type of thing that, yes, if we could get everybody to agree simultaneously, and commit to it and follow through.
And have trust in that system.
Have trust, we could be better off. No question about that. The challenge is, it's 8 billion people.
Right.
How do you trust the other 8 billion to do what they're going to do? Well, that's part of why we end up ignoring a lot of what's going on in the world. Right.
And it becomes a constant balance, again, between, if we're talking about investment versus like what do we feed into as far as, social systems or systems that, again, benefit individuals. What do we want to, put our energy towards? And energy in this case is literally just can be, monetary value. We buying into a specific stock, you're helping the growth of that particular industry.
Right. And that's just in terms of the material. I mean, there's also investing in relationships. I mean, right. Relationships don't go
individual level.
At the individual level.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't just, immediately come out of nowhere. I mean, it's typically there's time involved, right? You agree to do things and you follow through. So you build up this trust. Now, to the extent that in game theory, there's something called tit for tat, which is...
You do this, I do that.
What?
You do this, I do that, kind of...
Right. Yeah, it's...
Reciprocal services.
Right. It's a very interesting development out of game theory that one of the dominant strategies is if it's a repeated game. In other words, you're someone you're going to be dealing with over and over again. A dominant strategy is you trust someone at first, and you keep trusting them until they hurt you. And then after that, you don't trust them anymore.
Right.
And so you can see how if you're younger, okay, and you haven't had as many interactions, it's easier to just start with, I'll just trust people.
Right.
Okay. Because that's actually a useful strategy. Yeah. But eventually, when you get harmed, now it's how do you keep that trust?
Right.
And so it's a reminder that the importance of every new generation is not only that, you've got young energy, you have new ideas, but it's easier to trust whatever system is there if you haven't been disappointed by it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a sense of, I think, remaining optimistic, things like that. But I think it's really interesting, too, just having the parallel of, using an economic frame of mind when you're thinking about like your personal, just the way that humans operate. It really was a revolution for me when I started thinking about things like currency. and that currency is just flow. Like you think the current of a river, you know what I mean? So if the currency is there, right, it waters that system, so to speak, right? And you know, the idea of human resources and these ideas that's like, okay, we can provide a system for people, right? We're helping individuals, and then other people will, you know, jump into the river, so to speak, help with that. It will create current, right, in a system, right? And that's one of the things they talk about a lot with, you know, building economics or building a business. You know, you focus on providing for people, providing a service, and you create a system which money is the byproduct, because money is just a means of exchange, right? At the end of the day.
That's right. It's a signaling device. It's one of the ways that the economy says, hey, look, this really needs to be done. You know, people are willing to pay more for it. You know?
Yeah. No, I think that, you know, frame of mind really helps in general. Also, just even thinking in terms of how our education preps us for, you know, being a part of a financial world. I think in the early days of education, or early education, K to 6, 6 to even in high school, there's a real lack of financial education, it seems. You know, so people come out of or go into high school accepting loan, or go into college, you know, accepting loans that they know nothing about. They don't know what compounding interest is. They don't know what any of the things are. And there's been, you know, court cases with this where they're trying to get student debt relief and things like that, because, you know, they've coined us and said to some extent that it's predatory, that they're going after these 18-year-olds who just want to get educated, who just want to start their feet in. I mean, is there any sort of way to enhance financial education, or what do you think about the state of the financial education in this country?
In order to do financial education well, you have to have basic math.
Right.
So that's the first thing. You know, to fully understand compound interest, you need to be able to do basic algebra. Okay. I mean, in order to use it effectively. Right. Now, it may not be as hopeless as it appears. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a TikTok that just recently came out of a young man basically saying, I've had enough of, you know, these old boomers, you know, saying, oh, well, when I was younger, I made this amount of money and I was able to own my own home and have family. And what was interesting is he said he took his salary of like $31,000 and he said, look, here's the inflation calculator. Okay. Back in 1970, that was worth almost $250,000. Right. Okay. And so there's your financial awareness. Right. Okay. That what he was trying to communicate is that boomers, if you want to use the term, okay, when they grew up, when they were young, their understanding of what 10,000 meant, okay, or what 1,000 meant was very, very different. And this is one of the things I try to teach in my courses, is that there is the distinction between thinking rationally, which is just, here's the numbers, here's where the numbers are going, you know, dispassionate. And the fact that as we learn about life and society, we learn about money, you know, we develop an emotional charge around, is that expensive? Right. Is that inexpensive? Am I being ripped off? Am I taking advantage of the situation? And so you can picture, here's this number, it gets an emotional charge. As we grow up, that's still deep in our memory. Right. Right. And our emotions build off of that. So you can picture someone who was 20 in 1970, you know, if they were making 10,000 a year, they're like, okay, this is a pretty good start. Okay. And now you go ahead 50 years. And if they're talking to someone who's making 30,000 a year, their first emotional response is, well, that worked for me. Right. You know, right. At the emotional level. Right. In the practical level, it's like, it's not even close.
Yeah. Because also, even if you look at like what salaries were and what like house prices were, like back in the 60s, something like that, like a home was about like 2 years salary, or something around that. When nowadays, you know, if someone who's making 30,000, you have a house that's 300, that's 10 years of your salary
At least.
in order to own this. So there's like kind of a larger burden of, you know, this generation being able to get to ownership. And I think that's a lot of where the frustration comes from, a lot of why people are looking at things like other currencies and really trying to become lucrative. But
and understandably so. That's understandable.
So, I mean, what do you think, maybe just as we wrap up here, like, what do you think are some good things that maybe young people can do, maybe to find financial literacy or even to like advance themselves? I don't know if you recommend something like life insurance or annuities or having a trust or something like that. Are those things that are viable for us?
As far as insurance, annuities and such, you kind of need to have resources that need to be protected.
Right.
So actually, the first thing to do is to accumulate a kind of a rainy day fund. That's the first thing to do. Figure, by making sure not to spend more than you're making, which is difficult. I'm not saying that this is easy.
Right.
If you can at least get 3 to 6 months, preferably 6 months or more, but at least 3 to 6 months worth of finances, you know, you're not touching that. Okay.
Right.
It puts you in a situation that if a bill comes up out of nowhere, right? One, you can pay it. Okay. You're not having to borrow money to pay it off, because now that's going to get expensive over time. And on top of that, you're conserving your capacity to handle anxiety and stress.
Right. Right.
Because that's one of the things that really shuts us down and disables us, when we get overwhelmed by how the finance is going to work. Right.
Rationale shuts off, logic shuts off.
Exactly. When you need it the most. And so, the first recommendation is, get 3, preferably 6 months worth of your monthly budget saved. Okay. So you're in a position. It's, at first 6 months is going to seem like a lot, okay, because it's going to take a while to get to. But in the big picture, just having 6 months aside in, a savings account or a checking account, that is not going to impact any kind of long run investing, either in stock or commodity or whatever. But it's going to give you a lot more sleep at night. Yeah. Which means that, one, your health will be better, and you need your health if you're going to, be productive and successful. You'll have a little less anxiety. Again, that's going to help you with the decision making. You need to be clear-headed. Right. You can't have the world be, constantly pushing you around and feeling like you're always at a loss. Right. And then your back is against the wall. Your back is against the wall. Yeah. I think one of the big things too is like trying to almost decrease the amount that because for example, there's, income taxes, sales tax. There's literally something called a death tax. So it's usually called an estate tax, but yes. And then inheritance tax, you know what I mean? So it's like you can't even pass things down to your children without it being a percentage of that being taken away. And this is why I've kind of looked into people who talk about making a trust or putting it into life insurance policies, because as those things grow, you can pull from them and put into them tax-free. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of leaving a legacy for your children or for others, yes, those become very, very important. But again, that's typically when you're at the point in life where you have now accumulated enough, where it becomes important to make sure that it can get passed on. So you have to get to that point first to have something to be worried about. Right. Okay. Yeah. And in the beginning, that means spending less than the income you're taking in. And so that's one of the challenges we kind of have early on. But you also have to make a distinction between consuming something because it's something you want to do right now, something you enjoy, versus spending on something that's going to generate more income in the future. And
Right.
you kind of need that clarity.
Right.
Okay. And that intuition between this is something I enjoy, but once I consume it, it's done.
Yeah.
Versus, if I get a car and that enables me to save a lot of money on, Uber or this,
Right.
or if I need to get someplace in an emergency, I don't have to first figure things out.
Right. Yeah. So again, as you talk about that long-term decision making and what you're even talking about here, like assets, creating something that's going to eventually pay you back if you buy a particular thing that makes you, optimizes your process, right? Makes you better at what you do, makes you more efficient. You can, then perform higher. And, I'm all for social entrepreneurship. I love that stuff.
Yep.
I think we need more of that in the world. People solving modern issues and being, kind of creating that financial literacy, I think is really important to this generation. Yep. But yeah, again, finding that idea, finding your passion, finding what you're good at, serving people, and money, in that sense, becomes a byproduct, I would think,
I there's some truth to that, but it's also useful to keep in mind, it is not so much do what you love and the money will follow. It's figure out how to love that, which will help you get the things that you want.
Yeah, seeing where the demand is, right? What do people need?
Well, not only what the people need, it's if you follow your passion, okay, yes, you'll put more energy into it in the beginning and all that, but it's often the case that at some point, after we've done a lot of something, that passion starts to subside. And then what are you going to do? Right.
So looking for where demand sits, or what people need, or
what you want to do for your life.
Right.
So it's not even a matter of the demand of other people. It's what are you going to do with your life, and how is your approach to what you need to do in order to make life work? Are you going to feel slighted because you're not doing what you really, really want to love to do? Or are you appreciative of the fact that what you're doing enables you to have your family and to go on vacation and all of that?
Right.
And so part of it is you'll invest more in something that you're passionate about, but you may also investing too much, because that doesn't necessarily mean that's what everyone else wants.
Right. Yeah. It's a constant balance.
The constant balance.
100%. Cool. Well, awesome words of wisdom. Dr. David Axelrod here on the show, professor of economics, having the book come out relatively soon?
Hopefully in the next year.
Cool.
Yeah.
So keep an eye out for the economics of time and mind.
Yep.
Coming out soon. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Very cool. And we'll see you guys next time on Conscious Endeavor.